know, it seems very formal with me standing here.
We demand no less.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's the esteemed panel. I don't know, I talk better standing up or something. So anyway, good morning. My name is Beth, Richie, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this workshop this morning. It's a pleasure to have these three women gathered to share some insights, challenges, learning moments from their work. The title of this workshop is Domestic Violence, Unpacking Dynamics and Consequences of Intersectional Subordination. And it seems to me that this is an appropriate way to start this, start our day today, because so much of the work that's been done that's good in responding to the problem of gender violence is work that's intersectional. Some might argue that's the best work that's been done to end violence against women is the work that looks at an intersectional analysis of subordination. So we have three people, three women who've come to share their learnings about that, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists very briefly. The real biography of who they are will emerge as they talk about their work. They'll each talk for about 15 minutes. I'm going to help keep to that. And then, since it's a small group, we'll just open it up quite informally to discussion, your discussion and presentation. Elizabeth MacDowell is going to start. She's a visiting professor at Chapman University School of Law, teaches courses in family law and domestic violence, and developed a clinical course in the Chapman Family Violence Clinic. So we'll hear about both some of her analysis and hopefully also some of the work that the clinic is doing. Our second presenter is Kimberly Robertson. She's a PhD candidate here at UCLA in women's studies. Her other academic work has been in American culture. She's doing a dissertation here on violence against urban Indian women. And our final presenter is Fumi Akinpelu, who's a postdoctoral research associate at the Burton Blant Institute. She has focused her work, her academic work, as well as her work now with community-based organizations on issues of disability, gender equity, empowerment of women with disabilities, and she's going to talk both about hopefully some of her academic work as well as her work with two programs, Arise and Vera House. So these are our workshop presenters, and we'll get started now. Thanks.
I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint if I can find my mouse. Do you see it? Oh wait, I see the arrow.
It's an odd view that you're sitting.
I know, I can't really control it. No, I'll be fine once I get it open. And I have it backwards, that's part of my problem. Okay. Ta-da. And slideshow. Okay. So huge.
Bigger than life. So.
I know. I'm glad I'm not looking at it. It's kind of intimidating. So good morning. I'm really happy to be here, and that the organizers of the symposium were able to find such a great home for my paper proposal with these other presenters and their work. My goal in the project that I'm going to talk about today is to develop a framework for theorizing the relationship between structures of subordination in the context of domestic violence. Basically a framework for connecting the dots, if you will, of the locations that intersectionality helps us identify. And more specifically, my objectives are to identify a framework for analysis that allows us to accomplish three things. One, to inform more fully or more carefully modulated policy responses. Two, to better facilitate the movement building that Professor Crenshaw envisioned in her original articulation of intersectionality. And three, to strengthen an analysis of the relationship between domestic violence and other forms of subordination. And I conceive of this project as a reform of feminist theory about domestic violence. But that said, I don't think the problems that I'm going to talk about or the solutions that I'm trying to work on pertain only to feminist theory. but given the centrality of feminist theory to domestic violence law and policy, I think it's important normatively and developing a more rigorous feminist theory about domestic violence. So what I'm going to do in this brief presentation is discuss the benefits and the limitations of intersectional analysis of domestic violence as currently constituted in feminist theory about domestic violence, and talk about how we might better utilize the insights of intersectionality to support an anti-subordination agenda like this one. And unfortunately, for the time constraints, I've had to kind of strip out my examples. So maybe those examples from practice can come up in questions or discussion, but I think they're also going to come in with the other presentations that we have on the panel this morning. And I also want to mention that this project is in its very early stages, so I'm really looking forward to your feedback, especially about the structure of or framework for my analysis, which is where the project builds. So I'm going to talk briefly about benefits and drawbacks. And to do that, I want to back up for a minute and tell one origin story, because Professor Harris pointed out last night, there are many origin stories about intersectionality, and I just want to give one frame for looking at how intersectionality comes into feminist theory about domestic violence. And to do that, I'm going to frame it in terms of a tension between generality and particularity in feminist theory about domestic violence, with intersectionality as a form of particularity. And some of you have heard me talk about this before. For our purposes, generality can be understood as the effort in feminist theory to link domestic violence and heterosexual relationships to women's subordination based on gender in the context of patriarchy. And an unmodified, if you will, gender explanation for domestic violence has distinct advantages. First, it provides a unitary explanation for the way that women's subordination in personal life, in this case in intimate relationships, are connected to the political through the construct of patriarchy. It's also closely related to the concept of universality, which has political appeal. And Kimberly Crenshaw articulated that appeal and critiqued it in her discussion of how the politics of passing the Federal Violence Against Women Act. But generality has distinct drawbacks as well that derive primarily from this big category of gender. First, it's monolithic, and it can't really show us the ways in which particular women are, or groups of women, are at risk for domestic violence. And as Professor Crenshaw demonstrated, it also is racialized in ways that make women of color harder to see. The model is also both over and under inclusive. It claims to explain domestic violence based on gender, but by excluding same-sex domestic violence, it can't account, it doesn't account for all gendered violence or all women's experiences under patriarchy. Finally, it also makes men harder to see with specificity. By foregrounding gender as an analysis of women's subordination, men are more or less regulated to this background of patriarchy, so their experiences aren't examined with specificity any more than women's are. The category of particularity, including intersectionality, emerged from some, though not all, of these critiques of generality. And let me see if I'm getting up there. So I've crudely depicted intersectionality here, and we can see that it allows us to see the ways that gender is intersected with other social locations. And I've just thrown up a few: race, class, and citizenship or immigration status, which are certainly not all of the potential intersections, but just to give you an idea. And the advantages of an intersectional analysis are that it allows us to analyze the significance of specific social locations within these intersections to vulnerability to domestic violence. And in that sense, particularity is more inclusive. A more particularized analysis also allows us to identify specific solutions to problems faced by victims, something that my co-panelists are going to elaborate on. And to the extent that men may be intersectional subjects too, particularity allows them to come at least into better focus. but there are drawbacks to particularity in this guise, and this isn't. Some of these drawbacks have been articulated as drawbacks to intersectionality per se, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. I don't agree with that analysis. However, it can be a drawback to intersectional analysis as it's constituted in domestic violence scholarship and praxis, and intersectionality doesn't necessarily tell us how to continue connecting the particularities, which is something else I'm going to talk about. So the question that arises is, how do we theorize the dynamics of domestic violence? For example, as intersectionalities multiply, how do the categories they consist of relate to one another? And what do persons within these intersections have in common that matters? Also, the structures of subordination identified, at least in this kind of formulation, are no less monolithic than our original category of gender was, except at the center. They are only more specific by virtue of their relationship to one another. Therefore, as constituted, the model is still both over and under inclusive. And as a result, despite the benefits of particularity, gray areas remain that inhibit additional progress. So what I'd like to talk about now are several shifts that I think can help address these issues and deepen an intersectional analysis of domestic violence. And my recommendations are going to move in two main steps. First, a move from a crossroads to an emphasis on the spaces between these intersections. Now, what I want to note here is that I'm not sure that this is really a reformulation or a reworking of intersectionality or an articulation of intersectionality that's sometimes missing from the analysis. But it's come to my attention, especially in sometimes what's referred to as post-intersectional literature, which was referred to last night, that first formulation that I had up there, that's the one I wanted to keep, is how intersectionality is often critiqued and viewed. And this is actually how I viewed it. But again, it's not clear that everyone sees it that way. It certainly doesn't always manifest that way in the literature, and so I at least want to make this analysis explicit. Because I think by opening up these spaces in between structures of subordination allows us to see the multiple social locations within them and invites a comparison, a meaningful comparison between them. We're also better able to see that these structures create a continuum in which groups and individuals have both subordinate and superordinate status. And this allows us to grasp relative relationships to power and invites more precise comparisons of groups or individuals within these intersections, which in turn can deepen our analysis. Step 2 of my recommendation proceeds in several parts. First, my proposal is that feminist theory rename this category, which I had previously labeled gender for the purpose of kind of framing this intersectional analysis and how it comes in. I think we need to rename the category of what we're talking about, what feminist theory had been talking about initially, which is domestic violence and heterosexual relationships, which resolves a fundamental contradiction within feminist legal theory, but retains the category, which I believe is an important heuristic device. Second, my proposal abandons what the earlier depiction leaves as a monolithic conception of gender and makes gender an intersectional category as well, which I hope will open up new possibilities for analyzing the relationship between gender and domestic violence. And third, my proposal requires an analysis that moves horizontally across social categories, which I hope will facilitate the development of particularity within each category and also between categories, including between heterosexual and same-sex partner violence, which is, of course, itself intersectional. And in reality, these two columns would overlap. In closing, I want to acknowledge that, again, speaking in really broad strokes here, and I hope that we can fill in a little bit as we go on. But I also want to acknowledge that these depictions are limited by their two-dimensionality, and so they're really not getting at the multidimensionality that I'm talking about. And it's come, in discussing this with colleagues even this week, alternative depictions that might better capture where I'm going with this have come together. And one of my colleagues, we drew this in our office the other day. So it's a circular depiction that might better capture the changing nature of identity and social position, but still allow us to do what I think intersectionality does so well, which is to pin a particular location for the purpose of analysis, which is especially suitable to developing law and policy. And despite the limitations of these, of a project like this, my belief is that a feminist theory that analyzes domestic violence as subordination by analyzing across categories of social difference, including but not limited to gender, will be better able to move around the variables that inform women's and men's experience, support a more complete understanding of the problem, and improve interventions. And most importantly, I believe it can help us understand, most important to this project, help us understand not only the dynamics of the ways that forms of subordination work together, but also at the same time the dynamics of the individual categories of subordination, how they function, both alone and in tandem. Thank you. Ready? You hit escape. Just hit escape and I'll pull up hers. Thank you. Oh, here we go.
Good morning, everybody. I'm quite excited to be here. Actually, I've been learning a lot since yesterday, about intersectionality, and then trying to look at disability studies in this, in this field. And when you look at that word, I think it fits perfectly into disability studies, because disability cuts across so many social issues. And that's why particularly I'm interested in discussing this morning about intersection of disability and domestic violence. And particularly because I'm working on a project right now, looking at how these dynamics of intersection has really affected women with disabilities in accessing services. Because when you look at domestic violence, we focus on so many things, but we don't take cognizance of how this dynamics of intersection, is affecting women with disabilities. So that's why I try to depict this intersection with this. Because when you look at it, there's, I try to, look at that word intersection and see how I could summarize this view, and I came across this image. When you look at domestic violence among women with disabilities, there are a lot of things going on that is affecting them in accessing services. So I'm going to discuss these different forms of experiences and how it affects the accessing services, and how we could unpack these dynamics by helping them to enjoy services. Because I believe that when talking about the word accessibility, is a matter of inclusion. When we are cognizant that these individuals, they are part of the society, and we try to make service accessible to them, they too will be able to have a voice in the community and also enjoy what others are enjoying. Talking about domestic violence and sexual violence, we know it's It's a matter of power and control. And that leads us to the power and control wheel, which we are all familiar with. And we're talking about issue of gender, we know that one has been established. But when you look at women with disabilities, apart from all these, dynamics, there's another thing that they're experiencing, and that is this power and control wheel relating to their personal care assistants or their caregivers. And that's one of the things that's, because I'm working with a group of women that are survivors of domestic violence. And with this interaction, they're able to give us report about their experiences, which inform this project. And most of the experiences they share with us in this focus group, they are so alarming with what the experience they have with their caregivers. Because in terms of intimidation, we know that at home, with their partners, they experience that. But with their caregiver, what they're experiencing in terms of violence is alarming. And then when you now come to this group, the deaf community, because when you look at the disability, and deafness is a culture, and in that community, what they experience in terms of domestic violence is that we assume that deaf community is small. It seems that they are able to, handle some certain situations. But with the feedback from this, we realize that in terms of their experiences, we need to really understand what they are going through and provide services to really serve them. In terms of prevalence, what is the number, what is the percentage? I have compiled, information on this, and after the workshop, you can have copies. And I'm talking about reported information. Most of abuse going on in the disability community is unreported. Why? Because people don't believe that abuse is going on among persons with disability. And some of them even are afraid to even tell the story because people will not believe. We invited men from the police department to share with us about their work. And then, they talked for almost 1 hour, and then we were asking questions. And I asked this question, and man said he has been working, in that aspect for the past 16 years. I said, can you give us information, just give an estimate of how many people from the deaf community or disability community that you have really attended to in your unit? He said, none, for 16 years. I was saying that for 16 years, individuals from this community have not experienced violence or abuse. It is because of lack of services. I'm talking about different forms of abuse. We know name calling, putting down, using accusations and blame, and so verbal. It could be physical, it could be emotional. And I want to share the story of one survivor. I printed a story, and I also give it up. I attended a conference in Nashville in 2008, and this woman was there, and she shared her experience with us. And some of the things she shared was that she was in a relationship and she was being abused, but because of the fear of losing the partner, she didn't want to leave. For the fear that who will take care of me, she was in that relationship and she almost lost her life. So those are some of these dynamics that these individuals are experiencing. I have this form of abuse, and we have the physical, emotional, mental abuse. At times, some women even prefer you to kick them than not even kicking them. Because, you know, if you kick and then it's physical and maybe I can take care of myself. But if you are put in a, a situation, psychological situation where the person, does not even communicate with you in the house, even a kind of emotional tension, it's even terrible. Now, we know that about financial abuse. Women with disabilities are having, going through this abuse. Now, we want to go to looking at experiences unique to survivors of disabilities. There are so many reasons why they have these unique experiences. They can't defend themselves. One of the women in our group, she's visually impaired, said, if she's in a relationship, how will she escape if she's undergoing abuse? And these are some of the things that service providers are not really asking questions about. And most of service providers are not even addressing the trauma that these individuals are going through. One of these women shared with us that there was a day she wanted to find more about, the agency, and she called, and the lady at the desk said, oh, you want to know more about our agency? Go to our website. She's visually impaired. And she was trying to ask questions, but the lady was not sensitive. And we're talking about, well, what we are proposing is a kind of person-centered, service. But she was not interested. And when the lady kept asking questions, I said, go to our website. You have information about our agency. Get to the website. The website is not accessible. So some of the experiences that these women pass through. The deaf, the ability to tell or sign their experiences. One survivor was telling us that the police, there was abuse going on, and the woman, she's hearing, and with the deaf, the partner is deaf. When the police came, they were asking questions from the abuser. And the deaf man was trying to explain trying to use gestures to explain. But the woman said, oh, don't listen to him, he's angry. And the police believed the abuser. So those are some of the experiences in this community. And then, lack of information about accessible victim service or, of shelter. And general lack of resources to survive alone. For instance, we know that talking about poverty and disability, some of these women, they are poor and so that's why they stay in their abusive relationship for so long that we're talking about how service providers can assist them. Other examples include destruction of, denial or access to speech communication and devices or adequate, adaptive equipment. The abusers, they know that if they're able to do this, these women, they continue to undergo the abuse. So we are trying to propose that for us to unpack these dynamics, of intersection, of domestic violence and disability, we must remove barriers in accessing services. And how do we remove these barriers in terms of physical barrier? We're talking about making sure that our agency is accessible to women on using wheelchair. Talking about providing communication services in ASL interpreters. Then providing services in materials in alternative formats, braille, large print, and lastly, making sure that we are providing person-centered and trauma-informed services. And this includes safety, empowerment, because we need to empower these individuals. They should be, we should collaborate with them so that we could we should think outside the box, not fixing them into our program, not taking cognizance of their personal needs. So I'm so impressed by this material that we were produced. That talking about providing services, we must have these access symbols so that men with disabilities will know that they are welcome, in the agency. Because if they pick up any brochure and doesn't have these access symbols, they might not know that we are providing accessible services. Thanks for participating.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. Okay, what I bring to you today are condensed thoughts from the larger research project that I'm working on concerning urban Indian women, the construction of identity, domestic and sexual violence, organizing approaches to eradicate that violence, and Native feminist knowledge production. As an entry point into this project, I'd like to share with you brief glimpses of the 3 primary conditions that propel my political and intellectual work. Condition number 1. In 1990, Comanche activist and director of the Native American Women's Health Education Resource Center, Sharon Asatoyer, attempted to open a domestic violence shelter in Lake Andes, South Dakota. Asatoyer was immediately contacted by the city council and informed that she needed a zoning variance for the location the center had chosen for the shelter. As Lake Andes is disputed territory, that is land not clearly defined as on or off the Yankton Sioux Indian Reservation, as a result of centuries of federal policies aimed at diminishing and eroding native land holdings, Asatoyer was slightly concerned about the situation. Her apprehensions were not unwarranted, for during that meeting, Mike Whalen, the deputy state's attorney, himself assigned to protect victims of crime, stood and argued against opening a shelter that would primarily serve Native women in Lake Andes. He stated, quote, "Indian culture, as I view it, is presently so mongrelized as to be a mix of dependency on the federal government and a primitive society, wholly on the outside of the mainstream of Western civilization and thought. The Native American culture as we know it now is a culture of hopelessness, godlessness, of joblessness and lawlessness," end quote. Needless to say, the Resource Center was denied the zoning permit. Condition number 2. Violent crime victimization for Native women is higher than for all other populations in the United States. 1 out of every 3 Native women will be raped in their lifetimes. 3 out of every 4 Native women will be physically assaulted. Native women are stalked at a rate more than double that of any other population. And during the period 1979 through 1992, homicide was the 3rd leading cause of death of Native females aged 15 to 34. Violence against Native women is a problem of epic proportions that not only endangers the lives of individual Native women, but also erodes the sovereignty of Native nations and destroys Native communities both on and off reservation. Condition number 3. As I more officially began the academic project of interrogating the problem of violence against Native women when I began my graduate studies at UCLA in 2006 and came to the work that developed into my American Indian Studies master's thesis in 2007, critical and sometimes crisis-inducing questions about my own relationship to violence, Native communities, reservation borders, and urban spaces surfaced. How could I, an urban mixed-blood Indian, whose personal creation story begins not with a hollow log, a mound of clay, a turtleback, or the clearing of the fog to reveal my animal clan, but rather with the pain, terror, and violence that accompanies alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual assault, and domestic abuse, articulate any sort of understanding or relationship to Native tradition? How could I, a rather textbook illustration of the consequences of colonization, such as assimilation, relocation, abandonment, internalized racism, violence, and historical trauma, express a worldview, or initiate a research project that could be described as Native as opposed to anything else. Granted, when I ran into my homeless Muskogee grandfather on the streets of Stockton, California for the first time a couple of summers ago, I was looking for tradition and a Native homecoming. But what I found were stories of prison, incest, murder, abuse, and poverty. These realities don't mesh well with the bona fide and more authentic Indian persona I often find myself wrestling with and longing after in dreams of identity and inclusion. Fortunately, I refused to allow these constraints to stifle my energies and instead pushed forward, initiating academic and political projects that fuse together the multifaceted conditions I have briefly described for you. From the very beginning of my efforts to end violence against Native women, I have been committed to exploring the ways in which, urban Indian women, in the United States in particular then, are located within this phenomenon. With over 60% of Native peoples living in urban areas, and with Los Angeles having the largest population of urban Indians in a major metropolitan center, I find it both startling and worthy of investigation that there are no shelters that serve Native women or have culturally competent services for Indian women within LA. Furthermore, there is relatively little research on violence against Native women within urban communities in the United States. Thus, as I first began the work on my master's thesis, I imagined it as a small portion of my dissertation project in which I would learn from various reservation models of indigenous resistance to gender violence across Indian country in order to bring those models home to the Native women in Los Angeles. From here, I hope to have dialogues about how we might utilize and or reconceptualize portions of these reservation-based models to work for us in the LA area. So I embarked on that project, and I conducted approximately 72 hours of interviews with Native activists instrumental in the birth and growth of the South Dakota Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I spent hours visiting with elders in their homes, work sites, and communities, and eventually collaboratively produced a case history that documents critical moments, locations, and events in Native women's mobilization efforts against violence. By centering the voices and concerns of these women, and accordingly by decentering the mainstream colonialist narrative that typically narrates such historical events, I was able to glean insights from perspectives generally marginalized and trivialized. Throughout my time working with my Native aunties in South Dakota, however, I also found myself having conversation after conversation about the tragedy that urban Indian women also face staggering rates of violence, but that ultimately they should return to their respective Native nations, read reservations, if they really want help from their communities. Otherwise, I was instructed, they shouldn't truly expect to seek justice as Native women because the U.S. does not have an obligation to individual Native peoples, but rather to sovereign Native nations. If these women have quote-unquote chosen to leave their reservations or their nations, then they must fight violence as women of color, not as Native women per se. The policing of Native women's identity implicit in these arguments astounded me. But more than that, they broke my heart, because these sentiments were not espoused by the state. They were spoken by women who respected my work, invited me into their homes, trusted me with some of the most difficult work they'd done in their lives, loved me as a relative, and yet would, in the end, argue that I'd chosen to leave or not return to a community in Oklahoma that 2 generations of violent men in my family had alienated me from. Ultimately then, this argument goes, I do not deserve the same sort of protection from violence that Indian women on the reservation deserve. Additionally, these rigid and limiting conceptualizations of the bodies that constitute Native nations and their geographic locations in the U.S. immediately reminded me of the all-consuming panic and self-doubt I had associated with articulating my own location within the Muskogee Nation and Native communities before I had begun to take seriously the possibilities of re-articulating Native experiences beyond static, ahistoricized romanicizations of an original and traditional Indian somehow positioned outside of the colonial experience. Informed by critical moments such as these, I now recognize that the absence of urban Native women from discussions of violence against Native women both inside and outside the Academy is not simply an oversight, but has to do directly with the ways in which gendered urban Native identity has been constructed. And as Cherokee scholar activist Andrea Smith reminds us, colonization has been and continues to be a gendered process. More pointedly, as Native scholars like Smith and Inez Hernandez Avila argue, the U.S. settler state has conceptualized Native women as a threat to the U.S. body politic since the earliest moments of colonization, in particular because of their abilities to reproduce Native peoples, Native communities, and by extension, Native claims to land. Urban Native women, then, incite an enhanced sort of settler state panic because, in addition, they upset the colonial dream that Dakota Sioux scholar Phil Deloria argues underpinned the creation of the reservation system that attempts to contain and manage Indian peoples in spaces that are able to be carefully surveilled and controlled, like the prison system then. The epidemic of violence targeted toward Native women and then the restriction of state-controlled resources to reservation-based programs evidence these arguments. However, also critical to my work are the ways in which Native nations have, too, constructed urban Native women as a threat to the state. And here I'm referring to the Native state. For example, when Native nationalists, or Native activists for that matter, rely on definitions of Nativeness that are steeped in colonialist discourse and reify binaries such as reservation urban, which Seneca scholar Mashana Goman reminds us are themselves colonial constructs, urban Native women become conceptualized as somehow less authentically and less legitimately Native women. Furthermore, these urban Native women are not simply constructed as superfluous to the authentic Native nation, but again become figured as a threat to an otherwise more pure and healthy Native body politic. In Foucauldian terms, urban Native women are constructed as the biological threat, or that which has the potential to contaminate through reproduction, the thinning of Indian blood, the loss of Indian culture and tradition, etc., the authentic, read federally recognized Native nation. In conclusion, my project now moves far beyond attempting to bring resources to urban Indian women who face violence in the Los Angeles area. It goes beyond attempting to understand our experiences and locations as victims of colonization and state-inflicted violence, as well as personal violence. It goes beyond debating whether we have more access to economic resources if we identify as women of color or as Native women entitled to Title IX monies under the Violence Against Women Act. It even reaches further than attempting to initiate more honest dialogue and alliances between urban and reservation Native women. Excuse me. All of these political projects are important to the survival of Native women in urban settings, and I do plan to address them at some level in my research. However, I now recognize that eradicating violence against urban Native women must emerge from a much more radical analysis that challenges the very assumptions in my previous work. In rethinking these colonial gender dynamics, my analysis must concern itself with the very ways in which urban Native women have become simultaneously marked as enemies of the state and marginalized as subjects existing beyond state protection. It must consider how the identities of urban Native women have been crafted by various parties in ways that perpetuate that violence. Further, it must consider the ways in which alternative conceptualizations, or perhaps more precisely, deconstructions of urban native identity have the potential to explode the very foundations of colonialism, power, and domination. Mudo.
Well, thank you to the three of you for stimulating presentations and generation of some really important ideas. I'm going to raise some of them and then invite those of you who listen to join in with us. Elizabeth, thank you for your theoretical revision. I think it helps to, I like the moving things. I'm not very good at that, so I appreciate the skill that goes into it, but also the thinking that's behind it. And I want to pick up a little bit on some of the questions about what we do with particularity in terms of policy reform. That is, how do we kind of make our work different because of a particular versus a generalized reform, and in particular how that might link to issues of disability and urban Native women. And then Funmi and Kimberly, I think your insights into the particularities of subordination, particular subordinations, have been important to us. Kimberly, I think you left us with a challenge about a more radical analysis and a radical practice. I think we have some ideas about a different analysis. Is it more radical or not, right? We can ask. But how do we go beyond, should we, and then if we should, how do we go beyond, Funmi, something that takes us further than a kind of person-centered approach? I think you used that word, which was important. Person-centered approach to removing barriers, making services more accessible, to something that's both theoretically and then politically going to lead us to a radically different kind of work. Both are important. How do we make sure we're doing both? So to me, the question that I want to maybe start with is, so given what you've said, we have a different theory, we have insights into particular subordinations around violence against women. How do we move to a place where our work is theoretically radical as well as a radical praxis? And what does that then mean for the individual women who are seeking services, whether they're women with a disability, urban Indian women, or the other women that show up in the various spaces between the axes that you presented? It's a big question, but is there anything?
That's a big question.
It's a big 4 or 5 questions, but sort of where do you hear from each other, places where your work might be informed by each of your presentation?
Well, I'll jump in and say that I was really struck by Kimberly's connection of her personal story to her work, and that came up in the panel last night, and I think that's so important to ground in one way or another kind of our personal connection to our work, and that's kind of an observation. Mm-hmm. I'd say that one, and this doesn't necessarily connect to that comment, which I just wanted to put out there, but it's something maybe we can continue to think about, is that one way that I'm trying to think about making theory radical is by trying to be attentive to the connections between intersectional locations, which is something, a way of, or a framework for doing that was something I was trying to address in my presentation. And I think that although I focused on a framework and that goes towards methodology, I think there's a normative component to that too, that involves a commitment to thinking about the ways that, as we look at a particular problem, both describing the boundaries of our particular analysis, but also making that extra effort to think about how it might connect to other social locations as we go forward with our analysis. And part of that might be also addressing our own personal relationship to our theory.
are you sitting forward because you were going to respond to that?
I was going to respond, I think, more first to the larger set of questions that you were asking, Beth. I think that sort of where some of the impetus of my project comes from is, I think the way that intersectionality was sort of interpolated in a sense by the state, and when we think of sort of the anti-violence movement and a lot of these things, and the panel yesterday actually, Katie, right? That Katie's in here from the panel yesterday that Andy Smith was on, and Mimi and Clarissa and Katie were on. We were talking a little bit about where insight came from and some of these things. We're talking about the anti-violence movement and sort of how it sort of became, in a way, sort of interpolated by the state, and the ways in which sort of intersectionality and some of this, let's see if I can articulate this, the way in where let me just stay with my project then for a minute. When I'm trying to think about, for example, with violence against Native women, this is a problem that primarily originates from the state. And, I could talk at great lengths about that, but from colonization, and then we could move through historically through the boarding school process, through sterilization of Native women. But this is a problem that originates from the state, is perpetrated by the state. And then what we see happen is through the Violence Against Women Act, and then particularly through Title IX, we see the state responding as sort of this savior, and responding as becoming the one who is going to sort of fix violence against Native women also. So they become the place that we're going to turn to resolve the problem. And I think that we could, I'm not as articulate about it, but we could talk about the entire anti-violence movement as that we could see examples of the same thing happening. And so where the impetus of my project comes out of is that I think that often through intersectionality, and we can see that tool being used as a way to actually sort of make these subjects better knowable, better understandable, more readily make the subjects more readily available for the state to sort of regulate and control and read the subjects. So what I'm trying to do with my project is not actually then make the experiences of urban Native women more easy to be interpolated by the state, more easy to be read by the state. I don't want urban Native women to become yet another intersectional identity that the state can then take and regulate and read and save in that sense. Rather, I want to sort of make them unknowable, but I want to use that experience to sort of explode the state in a way. And am I answering your question at all, Beth? So that's sort of the point of my project is sort of to mess up the state, not look to the state, not do the same thing, but kind of. So what I would say then maybe is in terms of the other, in terms of some of these other projects, then is, how then could we, for example, how could we look for women with disabilities, and is there a way to provide better services for them, a way to because I understand the need to, at this moment, we want to work with them and provide services and things, but a way we can do that doesn't just, move them into the system. Is there a way that we can do that without, for example, just trying to, make shelters more, obviously there's a need to do that at this moment on the ground to help them. But is there a way to do that so that isn't the end result? That isn't the end goal, to just, does what I'm asking make sense?
Yes. Actually, when you talk about making services accessible, you're talking about training and retraining service providers. The Office of Violence Against Women, has released funds, grants, to make sure that we are providing accessible services. And we should go beyond that, because there's need for constant evaluation of the services that we are providing. Because at times, not talking about it's a form of community participation. We could do research to find out the effectiveness of the service that we are providing. For instance, before giving out the grant, what was the service? How did the service look like? But now, after using the grant to implement some of the objectives of the grant, how are now the services? So just moving from that community base, then making research to evaluate the effect of the services that we are providing. For instance, in some of the some of this domestic violence agency in my community, before the grant, the shelter was not accessible to women with disability. But now, one of the shelters now there's a room, accessible room for women with disabilities. Because when we talk about accessibility, we are so conscious of the cost, and we feel that it's expensive to provide accessible services. But we could look at the alternatives to make sure that we provide these services. As I normally tell people, inclusion is a kind of mindset. I mean, we're talking about inclusion. I want to include everybody. How do we reach out to these individuals? And when we have that mindset, we'll be able to go beyond the normal service that we provide.
And I think inclusion is a important and somewhat kind of tricky word sometimes, right? Because you can be included in sort of all the shit that society has to offer, right? Or you can be kind of politically included in the sense of resources and power is shared. And I think that there's some lessons to be learned about what we're asking for when we are asking for inclusion, and how to make sure that that has long-term benefit, not only a very small piece of very scarce, threatened resources. And it's interesting to think about whether the argument could be made, and I think it probably could be, whether the issue of violence in the lives of women with disabilities, which already needs to be unpacked because of the range of disabilities, right? But violence in lives of women with disability also emerges from state policy or position, in addition to an individual caretaker who might use one of the forms of abuse on the power and control wheel. And I think that's where we start to move into creating different kinds of solutions, potentially, and where that would fit then in the... So enough of my questions. How about, do you need the mic to, no? Okay, go ahead, Ann.
I just want to pick up on this question of disability. It's very interesting. In yesterday's panel on intersectionality and courts, I was thinking about sort of the structural intersectionality in terms of providing services for domestic violence victims, right? And so you have this notion that one of the reasons that women stay is for their children, right? And so when you have a disabled child, it creates a whole other layer of problems. And we had a client actually with a disabled child who stayed for 10 years because she couldn't get a domestic violence shelter to take them in because he was severely disabled. But their concern was liability, not access. So it's another layer that the courts actually perpetrate this kind of intersectionality.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so we might want to think about what it is, where our priorities are in terms of providing services as well.
Yes.
Congratulations to the three of you. I work domestic violence prevention.
Can you all hear in the back? You all right?
So I pretty much work continuously on the intersection of race and gender and immigration and class and etc. I was coming from the prevention approach. I was really interested in knowing, all we've talked about is intervention, so secondary prevention. So I was wondering, would there be any way of doing intersection work on a primary prevention strategy? And really I'm convinced that domestic violence happens because we're not preventing it. So we're trying to, right now what we're talking about is talking about the intersection. So once the domestic violence has already happened, once that domestic violence and perpetrators have been socialized in a way that subordination against women and against victims, whether they are, Latinas, disabled, Native American, where that construction has already been constructed. So I'm thinking on how can we work on an intersectionality approach through prevention. How can we, and not forcibly looking at a state prevention strategy, but maybe even a community mobilization prevention strategy. How can we cross all of these different categories to actually have, I wrote it here, leaving the state on the side and having a strategy that responds to the experiences of the different locations. So that's my question. What's the little bit?
Oh, good.
I think that awareness is very important. I mean, providing awareness to this, to these categories of people. For instance, when we had during the summer, we had a session with some women, and one of the service providers, our agency provides services for deaf teenagers, and based on what we did, she now invited the education officers in these agencies to give education to teenagers, deaf teenagers. And now for 3 months, these teenagers and girls that are deaf, they had that training, a kind of awareness. And at times, some people don't even know the signs of abuse, because it's circle of abuse. It starts from somewhere. And at times, we, at that teenage stage, if we are able to give a training and give awareness for teenagers to be aware of signs of abuse, it could prevent it. But if our teenagers are not aware, and when you are in a relationship, it's and your partner starts to abuse you, you think, oh, it will change, and it will change. And then by the time you go back to the honeymoon stage. But if you're able to identify these signs, these are warning signs. You want to know, do I want to go with this relationship, or do I want to back off? So we could prevent it through giving awareness, education to this group.
My question is more, how can we have a prevention strategy that responds to all of these intersections, that responds where we can have like an inclusive, where people with disabilities can get the message as well as Native women. So how can we create like an intersectional, multi-pronged prevention strategy? Because, I know how important it is to talk about intervention and how intervention has to be responsive to all of these different social locations. But again, domestic violence happens because we have not worked on the root of violence. So that's kind of where I want to get into. If it's possible to have a prevention strategy that looks at all of those intersections.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you saying like across cultures, across... I think that one of the important contributions of intersectional analysis is that, of course, there are going to be different, is that there are particularities to various experiences, and so they're going to play out very differently. And I think, I think it's important that various communities, take it upon, that part of being accountable to your community is to take it upon yourself to work within that community and to sort of address, what the needs of your particular community are. So I'm not sure that it would be that effective to try to have huge sorts of prevention workshops or huge prevention initiatives that try to address the large, very, very large sort of, like the diagram in the beginning of, I'm sorry, I forgot. Elizabeth, I'm sorry. In the beginning of Elizabeth's presentation, I'm not sure that it would be really effective to have these really large preventive initiatives. I think that it's probably the most, I think that in my experience with working in the Native community, it's the most effective for us. Native women won't seek shelter services that we won't, in the Los Angeles area anyhow, Native women will not seek shelter services in any other communities for the most part. So we won't seek shelter services in Latina communities, we won't seek them in mainstream white community, we won't seek them. So I think that it's the most effective to do preventive services within the Native communities, within urban Native centers already, and that sort of thing. I think, of course, within those areas, it's the most responsible, to take into consideration that we are going to have individuals with various disabilities. We're going to have individuals that are heterosexual, that are not heterosexual. We're going to have individuals of various ages, individuals of, and to take urban Indians, Indians from the res, Indians, to take those things into consideration and to try to make those as diverse and as, as possible. But I'm not sure that is that answering your question at all? Go ahead.
I want to disagree a little bit in that I think that one way, and this kind of goes back to your question and your response about exploding the state, which I thought was really an intriguing idea. And I think that one way to avoid state control is by communicating across groups. And so while communities need to talk to one another, they also need within themselves. I think that there's a lot to be gained by trying to speak across communities, across categories of difference, and figuring out a way to make that meaningful. Figuring out a way, there's been some great work by Trina Griot and others on the dangers of analogies. So I think we need to be careful how we go about that project and develop a language for how to meaningfully talk across groups and make meaningful comparisons and find meaningful connections. But I think that there could be important coalition work done that might enable Native urban women to seek refuge in, let's say, the Latina community in a way that they felt comfortable and that was meaningful. Maybe, maybe not, but forging those conversations can be a way to explode the state.
Right. I'm sorry, not saying that we shouldn't do alliance work and coalition building, but I'm thinking of sort of Andy Smith's work on the 3 pillars of white supremacy or something, and there is a different way in which colonization occurs, and there's a different way in which the state operates with different peoples. For example, her work on Orientalism, slavery, and colonization or genocide, and sort of there's a different way in which we are complicit in the ways in which other peoples are controlled and dominated by the state, and there's different ways in which our relationship with the state is. And I definitely think that coalitional work and that sort of work needs to be done. But I think also that on not that it's not all sensitive, but I also think that when on topics such as domestic violence, sexual violence, these issues that touch us intimately, for people that these things that are intimate to our lives, I think it can be difficult to come out immediately to people outside of your community and sort of work on those things. And I think that we could talk about it back and forth, but I do think that, sometimes that to start a lot of that work, that it does need to be done in your community. If you can't come, I just think that in my experience, the Native women will not seek those services elsewhere, then that's where they need to start. And then once we sort of have that consciousness raising and we're doing that work inside, then that's where then you come out from there, But I completely agree that we do need to, of course, because Native women alone aren't going to explode the state, right? I mean, we're going to have to do it together. So I agree.
I think obviously it's a very good question. and it might be a place where we need sort of further discussion about intersectionality as prevention, if we understand primary prevention as political mobilization, which I think is a word that you used. And primary prevention to prevent an initial occurrence of domestic violence is a different agenda than primary prevention that involves political mobilization, except really those might be the same things. But how do we do, I think the question is how do we hold both things in our head at the same time and have an intersection analysis of all of that so that the women in the group feel like there's a group of people who are similarly situated to me, and there's also a political movement outside that where allies are being built and people are talking about mobilizing. I mean, it's sort of like a lot of work, but it's also a lot of work to even conceptualize it. So I appreciate your question. Yes.
My name is Wanda Ramser, and I'm a UCLA alum, and thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I apologize for coming in late. I particularly appreciated, forgive me, I wasn't here for the initial panelists, the latter presentation where you are 50% mixed race, and a lot of the issues that I've dealt with in my life, I've reviewed many stories, but the most telling, of course, is about our homeless community. Other than we're 24/7 as we speak today, as well as the bias, the intersectionality of the different categories as the conference stated. But you specifically addressed the having to choose between the two, if I understood your words correctly, that you're 50-50 USA non-Native American, 50 USA indigenous people, in your case. The oral tradition and spoken word in my family on my mother's side is we're 6'3" full Cherokee. In those days, of course, it was not legal to intermarry. I'm sure everyone in the room probably knows. So one had to pass and present as to do whatever they needed to do. And my Blackfoot mother was always 5 different USA states where we lived, patronized, shall we say, to use my generation's word. I'm almost 60. Well, you can't be, you're too tall, you're too clean, you're too neat, and you speak USA English, the urban legacies, I'm sure you recognize, and you read books, and you go to libraries, and you go to art museums. You must be lying. You cannot possibly be fill in the blank. You must be Manchester. I mean, that whole thing. I also particularly wanted to comment, and this is a question, do you find, in terms of homelessness, you mentioned it was your father or your grandfather that was homeless, and what I find is that it's not only race or sexism, there's an entire denial in place that goes back, I don't want to monopolize the floor, out of respect, that people need to believe that anyone who is the bottom 1% of homeless must be mentioned. Not that that doesn't exist, but they need to feed into that it's not racism, it's not sexism, it's not those categories. So,
Before you answer, I realize a number of people came in late, and so I should just tell you the panelists' names, just Kimberly, Funmi, and Elizabeth. You're welcome. I should have done that sooner.
I'm sorry. The question is about. I'm sorry.
do you find that the homeless issue intersects with mixed race issues? I mean, it's open to anyone. And that impact, whatever, in terms of getting into USA government programs that would help them out, whatever their current situation.
Good, thank you for the clarification.
Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. It was also, we appreciated your comment as well. It was a
thank you.
comment as well as a question, yeah.
I don't actually, my research doesn't focus on the homeless. I would hate to generalize, but I certainly would assume that, like most populations, that there are tons of stereotypes, and I would, does anyone want to answer that? I don't know in particular would be my best answer, but I would imagine that that racism and sexism and homophobia, etc., abound in that population like it does everywhere else. Do you want to answer?
I felt like part of the question was fitting people into boxes to access services, and actually a friend of mine who's been homeless for many years and struggled with mental health problems, but that's not entirely why he's homeless. It was just recently talking to my husband and I about this problem that to get into transitional housing, he ended up being diagnosed with a mental illness, and now his continued access to services is dependent on him complying with taking medication and going to his counselor, and it's terrible. I mean, it's tearing him apart. He doesn't want to participate in this, and it's not what he wanted. He wanted help. So I think it's a tremendous problem, and it's a tremendous problem, definitely.
And in some ways, again, this is a more general answer than the specific, that the sort of having to be able to appear a certain way in order to get help is part of why we, I think, want to be careful about the way that the state is adopting intersectionality. That indeed, I don't think that the work that we're trying to do either in critical race theory or intersectionality is so that the state understands that there's more and more boxes that need to be filled by those people who can perform whatever the subordination is to their liking in order to get more services. And I think this is a sort of tragic example of that we need to kind of take it back a little bit and understand it as a kind of political strategy, not a strategy to expand who can qualify. Right. Because we'll just have to keep expanding, and the state will always have the control, and I would argue, at least with our current state, always use the control to keep people powerless, even if they have access to a shelter because of their mental health challenge. So. Other questions, comments? Amy?
Thanks a lot for the panel. It's not a question, I guess. I think the panel's been really helpful in clarifying a lot of the questions that I think a lot of us are raising continually in all of these workshops. And it really clarified this point that I think that we're making is how the anti-violence movement has used intersectionality to create different categories of clients, and then inadvertently creating new categories of criminals. And that's kind of what we've been doing, because we've been kind of an arm of the state in using intersectionality in that way. And that we really need to be cognizant to link any challenge to gender-based violence on a project of decolonization, which I think was so poignant in what you were saying, Kimberly. And just to, I also, I have a friend who did some research recently on women who were refugees from North Korea. I mean, there's a lot of things about North Korea which we could have days and days of topics on. But one of the things that she noticed was that it wasn't really fleeing political persecution, but the women that she interviewed, all of them, it was a small sample, so I don't know if it's scientifically verifiable, but they had, in particular, had issues around gender-based violence that they were fleeing. And this is a story that's not told at all in talking about the situation in North Korea. And just as you were talking about your need to leave the community, you know, it just reminded me of that story and of a lot of other stories I have in my own personal life. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting because when I was telling the story about the aunties in South Dakota, you know, telling me again and again that these women that urban Native women need to return to the reservation in order to seek services as Native women, you know, but they are well aware of the fact that many Native women actually leave the reservation because they're fleeing violence. And often reservations, you know, they're very isolated areas. Everyone knows everyone on the res. Often you can't even seek any sort of, you know, shelter or any type of services. So you have to actually leave the res in order to flee violent situations. They're well aware of that. But because of the way the Violence Against Women Act works, Title IX monies they're earmarked for reservation-based anti-violence programs. And so, you know, when we think of it in that way, then obviously, you know, it's an effort on behalf of the state to keep women on the reservation, where we then are sort of bound. We're more easily, you know, that's what I tried to make that point in the paper. Then we're able to be better regulated. We're able to be more, you know, more, in a sense, I mean, it's more of the prison industrial complex in that way. Yet Native activists, when they're thinking about that, and I don't want to generalize, I mean, I consider myself a Native activist, but the point I'm trying to make then is that, and I don't want to be calling out in that sense, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's that sort of that same kind of fighting over the limited resources. They don't want to lose those resources because reservations are the poorest places in the country. So they don't want those resources to go and be spread out across the United States, you know, and be accessible to any Native peoples. So they want to keep them on the reservation, which are very poor areas. It makes perfect sense, but you know, it's very interesting. So it's the same sort of thing, you know, fleeing the reservation because of violence, yet the women want them to return to the reservation because they want to keep the funding there. So.
I was listening to all three of your presentations and was struck by the fact that in one aspect or another, every single presentation was about seeking a more granular approach to personhood, understanding people as fully realized in all of their variations and the different things and influences that make people who they are. And I just think it's really interesting because we're sort of talking around resources and communities and grassroots organizing in this really particularly difficult financial moment, because this brings the whole idea of class and how we're changing as not only like a national identity, but also within smaller communities.
Right.
To me, it seems like the people that we think should be here to like listen to us discourse may not be the people who should be here. Maybe it's us. Maybe we're the ones that are supposed to start reconceptualizing the way that we organize. And is there a way to really capitalize on this very precarious economic moment so that you can explode the state? Because I think all of these ideas about sort of calling the state out and calling the ways in which we're all complicit in each other's oppressions in different ways is the moment now. Like, could we actually do something now and not? So I guess my question really comes down to, these are great ideas. Now, how do we tether the abstract to the real? Like, what are the ways in which we change our own communities? Like, so I am part of an academic legal community. I've also practiced. I have ties to different kinds of communities, religious and queer, and does everyone have a responsibility? Could we actually formulate a way to speak to all of the different ways that we want ourselves to be realized and have full personhood, and without pressing on people?
It's a good question.
That. That's a really vague.
Oh, it's a really good question.
It's a good question.
Sounds like the project.
Right, right. So I'm take a try at that. Well, I wasn't on the panel, but this is just going to add to the question, not answer it. When I was thinking about the various images that you put up, Elizabeth, I did sort of yearn for a moment for the day when gender was the only access, because I thought at least we knew how to at least I knew how to challenge the white feminist movement on its racism, and to try to push hard on issues of class, and to the extent that it has emerged as a white heterosexual middle class movement led by people who are making a lot of money. I thought I could just, as an outsider, I could push back on all of those things. That was an easier project than to think more complexly about something that really would have much more impact than just resisting white middle class heterosexual feminism. I mean, that maybe would have been enough, but it's really much more complicated than that. And I wonder about this particular political and economic moment. And I heard people say in many places yesterday, now's the time. And I guess I'm wondering why we think now is the time, when I feel we're moving back from anything that's complex and fighting in a way that I never thought we would around the kind of national crisis of the economy, the inability to, with our, your new president who can't seem to do the things that he promised he was going to do. I feel more discouraged, actually, not more, so I don't know. I wonder about this political time and what we can do. Although I feel like I'm in sort of the minority around that, because everyone yesterday was talking about the opportunity of our current crisis.
Collective delusion.
Or maybe I'm not talking to the right people.
I'm trying to get it too, and I think that on one part of me thinks there's always a moment, and at least I don't know how we seize it. Right? So I think there's always a moment. But on the other hand, I've kind of lost faith in that strategy ever since Reagan was reelected. In the 80s, that, the feeling was things are going to get so bad that we're going to have a revolution. Right. We're going to have a revolution, and it didn't happen. And I've been disillusioned since then. That's a long time. I'm a pretty, optimistic person. So I'm not sure, but I do think there's always an opportunity, but I don't get why right now is such a particular opportunity when we're so distressed. When services are bled dry, I don't get why it's an opportunity. Although I think we still need to figure out how to make an opportunity. Right. Do you see it differently?
Well, I'm new in the U.S. Actually, when you look at the economic situation here, realize that especially in terms of providing services, that's why we advocate. Because like in New York, the governor wants to remove this, remove that, and then
And New York wants to remove the governor, right? So around domestic violence.
And then one that I was talking about, making service accessible, and we are trying to remove some of the benefits. So where do we go from here? So it's a question that we are all asking at this particular moment.
This has been a really wonderful panel. Thank you so much for coming so early to give us these wonderful insights. My question is for Kimberly. I think I really appreciate your talk. I think you're doing wonderful work, and I'm so down to work with you on exploding the state. I think that's my favorite little soundbite. But I was wanting to ask a little bit more about the conversations that you had with your aunties in South Dakota, because I heard you saying that when they were kind of articulating this, what felt really like painful to say like, well, you've left, or like you chose to left or whatever, and so now you need to organize as a woman of color. You're not any longer allowed to like adopt an indigenous identity or have an affirmative indigenous identity. And then you said it hurt even more because it wasn't spoken by the state. It was spoken by what you consider your community. But what kind of struck me by that is like it wasn't spoken by the state, right? So then in the later kind of comments that you made were talking about how reservations are very much like the power, it's an apparatus of the state, it's something that the state uses to manage and to police and to regulate and to surveil, which I thought was very on point in key comments. So I'm just wondering what you think, I don't know if part of your project is kind of more of like if there's like a political kind of organizing component, if there's some kind of like critical dialogue that can happen, but how you imagine maybe in the future or like some future work figuring out how to bridge, right, like urban Native communities with communities on the reservation to have those really hard conversations about like, well, you don't belong here anymore, and you're like, well, but that's what the state wants us to believe, right? The state wants us to believe that like this utter displacement through genocide and colonialism is like what is right now, or is like displaces you from your own community now. So I'm just wondering how, if you thought about how you can even have those tough conversations.
Yeah, thank you. Let me clarify just one thing, is that my aunties, or the women in South Dakota, I definitely call them my aunties, they refer to themselves that way. They weren't saying that I am not Native, but what they're arguing is that definitely wholeheartedly I'm Native, and actually the woman that I am the closest with and did the most of the interviews with, she runs a shelter, like a large organization, and was like, come back and I want to give you the organization. So she's definitely like, come home, like come home and do this work. You're Native enough for that. But if you stay in the city, then you have to work as a woman of color. If you stay in the city, you cannot, if you stay in the city, don't expect to access resources as a Native woman. And the way the thinking goes is that because they're so entrenched in this idea that, and legally it's completely accurate, because they're so entrenched in the idea the U.S. government has a trust relationship with Native nations, not individual Native people. In the city, you're not a Native nation, you're an individual Native woman. So in the city, you have to organize as a woman of color, unless you're on the res. But if you're with your Native nation, come back, run this organization. So she wasn't necessarily, I just wanted to clarify for everyone, it's not necessarily that she was trying to negate my Native identity, but okay.
Yeah, but I think that's what, and I'm sorry if I misstated,
No,
so I definitely get that she was like, yes, you're Native, but if you're not working on the reservation, then like, the identity gets displaced in the sense that like, now you have to organize as a woman of color. So I'm just wondering how you kind of bridge that. Like, how do you have that dialogue? Like, that's exactly what the state wants, and the state wants us to be divided in that sense.
And so it's a really difficult thing for me to negotiate. And actually, as I was proposing my dissertation project, which there is a big political, like an organizing component to the project. My project isn't just sort of this theorizing stuff. What I'm doing actually is going to Minneapolis and working. Minneapolis has sort of the largest component of urban Native organizing in the U.S. And so there's some places there. The Minnesota Women's, there's a shelter called Eagle's Nest. There's the Minnesota Women's Urban Indian Center. There's like 5 or 6 places that I'm going to be visiting. And actually, Sarah Deere is here. She's speaking later today. If you get the chance to hear her, I'm going to work with her. There's some other women, but so I'm going to interview them. And what I want to do is sort of an intellectual ethnography, where I'm actually listening to how they theorize the organizing that they do in an urban space. And so I want to sort of see if we can utilize some of that and bring it back to LA. And long term, what I would like to do then is to sort of, work. Long term, I'd like to have a shelter in Los Angeles, have services for Native women, urban Native women. But so this was like this was the hugest problem for me, was thinking, how can I still honor these women, honor these elders in South Dakota who really are what I consider the grandmothers of this movement. You know, Tilly Blackbear, Karen Arch, a lot of these women who really started all of this organizing. How can I still honor them, honor my relationship with them, honor the work that they've done, but also I feel sort of, you know, move this work in another direction. And I would like to be able to have conversations with them at some point, but still do that in a really respectful way, you know. And it's difficult because it comes out of what I consider a lot of the work that, you know, all of the women who do intersectionality, Kim Crenshaw and everyone, you know, that work where they talk about, you know, not wanting to sort of pull the skeletons out of the closet in terms of talk about your community, but still exist inside of it. So, you know, not call out the community in terms of the same things that women talked about in terms of, you know, the Black Power movement, the red, you know, I'm sorry, now I'm getting all tongue-tied. But so how can I have these dialogues with these women and talk about ways that I see us being, you know, sort of using this colonial discourse, but also still be really respectful of the work that they have done. And that was the biggest sort of ethical concern I had with conceptualizing the entire project. And I'm still not really sure, you know, and that's discussions that I have almost every time that I, you know, that I really kind of air it out, is how I can do that work. And I just try to be as honest with myself as I can be and as honest with them as I can be, you know, and I don't do any of my work without letting them see it. When I did my thesis, everything that I wrote went back and forth with all of the women, and I'm sure there are parts that they weren't happy with, and I'm sure that my dissertation they'll be less happy with, but I guess that's all I can do. Yeah.
But it's terribly important, I think, that I mean, you're obviously very respectful in your approach, and I can tell it's from your heart in that, but it's about being self-critical as community members, and I think that's critically important and really does speak to what we have to do. I mean, that's primary prevention, is figuring out how we can update, modify, revise, reconsider what we've done, both politically and in terms of intervention, and sort of evaluate how far we've gotten and where we need to go next. So I'm going to take the opportunity of talking to transition into a thank you to the workshop presenters, and thank all of you for your comments and feedback, and we're hopefully going to be different when we gather next time, right? So thanks for coming. And